The Switch 2 is finally here, but it isn't without controversy. Many fans are upset by the lack of games available at launch, which made me want to look back at the history of Nintendo's launch titles and see what each console had to offer and how it defined that generation. The Nintendo Entertainment System, 1985. The NES didn't just launch with games, it launched with a mission to rebuild the American home console market after the infamous crash of 1983. That mission was spearheaded by one game in particular, Super Mario Bros. Super Mario Bros. Wasn't just a game, it was a cultural phenomenon still going strong 40 years later. Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, it took the simple idea of jumping over obstacles and infused it with expertly tuned level design, charming music, and responsive controls. The game's first level, World 1-1, has been studied for decades for how intuitively it teaches players mechanics without saying a word. The game was packed with secrets, power-ups, warp zones, and hidden blocks, which gave it a sense of depth that arcade games simply didn't have. For many, it was their first real taste of gaming at home, and it sold over 40 million copies, making it one of the best-selling games of all time. And while it didn't introduce us to Mario, it made him a household name who now stars in over 200 games. Other launch titles included Duck Hunt, which introduced the NES Zapper and brought the novelty of light gun gaming into homes. The satisfying click of the gun and the mocking dog became cultural icons and would eventually be added into Smash. Ice Climber, who you probably also know from Smash, and Excite Bike were also part of the early NES experience, offering vertical platforming and side-scrolling racing respectively. But it was Mario who truly carried the console on his back. There was a few more like Wrecking Crew and some sports games, but these games just aren't as well known today and didn't have the lasting impacts that Super Mario Bros. Had. Game Boy, 1989. Released in 1989, the Game Boy was Nintendo's first handheld since the Game & Watch, and the first one to play different games. The Game Boy would be supported for over a decade and would receive countless games, including Pokemon, which also would become another cultural phenomenon like Super Mario Bros. But we're just here to talk about the launch titles, and fortunately enough for the Game Boy, one of its launch titles became one of the best-selling games of all time. Arguably one of the most brilliant launch decisions in gaming history, Nintendo bundled the Game Boy with Tetris, a puzzle game developed in the Soviet Union. While it wasn't a Nintendo property, Tetris proved to be a masterpiece. Its extremely simple gameplay was perfect for portable play, easy to understand, but hard to master, and suited for both short and long play sessions. It appealed to a wide demographic from kids to adults and even attracted a female audience, something not common in gaming at the time. Tetris helped define the Game Boy as a universal gaming device and sold millions of units worldwide. To this day, there are still new versions of Tetris and a big community of competitive Tetris players. As a new Mario adventure on the go, Super Mario Land was a peculiar but charming departure from its console predecessors. Developed by Nintendo R&D 1 rather than Shigeru Miyamoto's team, it featured a very different art style, strange enemy designs, and new gameplay mechanics like Mario piloting a submarine. Despite its short length and somewhat awkward controls, it was a testament to how Mario could adapt to any platform. It wasn't just a scaled-down port, it was a unique experience that helped solidify Mario's dominance even in handheld form. The Game Boy did launch with a few other games, but these two certainly had the biggest impact. Alleyway was one of the others, and it's a fun game, albeit not the most original. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, 1991. When the SNES launched in North America, it launched with just 5 games, but one of them was Super Mario World. It wasn't just a sequel to Super Mario Bros. 3, it was a showcase of the new 16-bit generation. With its colorful visuals, expansive map, and tighter controls, Super Mario World set a new gold standard and is still considered by many, including myself, to be the best 2D Mario game of all time. Yoshi, who debuted in this game, quickly became a fan favorite. His ability to eat enemies and gain special powers added layers to the gameplay, and the Cape Feather introduced flight mechanics that encouraged exploration and creativity, and that would soon return with a new dimension, quite literally. The game's overworld map with branching paths and hidden levels gave a sense of player agency and scale that we hadn't seen before, and who could forget the music? Koji Kondo's soundtrack remains iconic to this day. Seriously, listen to some of these songs, it's one of the best soundtracks in gaming history. Although the SNES didn't launch with many games, it soon saw the arrival of classics like F-Zero and Pilot Wings. These titles were designed to showcase the system's Mode 7 graphics, 2D scaling, and rotation effects that simulated 3D. You might recognize this from Star Fox. They might not have had Mario's lasting appeal, but they were technological showcases that proved Nintendo had entered a new era. Nintendo 64, 1996. The Nintendo 64 launched with only 2 games in North America, Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64, but once again, Mario proved to be all Nintendo needed. Super Mario 64 did what Super Mario Bros. Did a decade earlier and basically created a whole new genre. It redefined what a 3D game could be, and Nintendo wasn't just putting Mario in 3D, they were reinventing how players interacted with Game World. The analog stick on the Nintendo 64 controller was revolutionary, even though it looks like it's made for 3-handed aliens now, but it allowed precise movement in a way that had never been possible. The game was filled with dynamic environments, secrets, and non-linear objectives. Players were free to explore Peach's castle, jump into paintings, and collect power stars in any order, and it was just freedom in a way platformers had never offered. The camera, though imperfect by today's standards, was a pioneering effort in 3D navigation, and the expressive animations gave Mario a level of personality that made him feel alive. Obviously, looking back today, it seems very simple, but 30 years ago this was cutting edge. To this day, Super Mario 64 is still widely considered to be an all-time great video game, And Nintendo, if you're listening, please give us a modern remake. Super Mario 64 DS was actually one of the first games I ever played, and that's something I'll get to a little later in the video. Pilotwings 64 was a solid secondary offering, showcasing the system's ability to render open landscapes and simulate flight. It wasn't the cultural juggernaut Mario was, unless maybe you're obsessed with Pilotwings, but it hinted at the expansive exploratory direction Nintendo was heading. Game Boy Color in 1998. The Game Boy Color didn't launch with a massive first-party game, but it did bring with it an enhanced version of existing hits. Tetris DX was a colorized and polished version of the original Tetris, adding battery-backed save functionality in multiple game modes. While not revolutionary, it was a solid and recognizable launch title that continued the legacy of the original. Nintendo GameCube 2001. The GameCube launched with a larger variety of games, 12 in total, but the headliner was Luigi's Mansion. It was a bold move. Instead of launching with the Mario platformer, Nintendo spotlighted his brother. In Luigi's Mansion, players explored a haunted mansion, vacuuming up ghosts with a Poltergeist 3000. The game leaned heavily into atmosphere with moody lighting, ambient sound design, and the nervous green plumber. Luigi hummed along to the background music, shivered in fear, adding charm and personality to a character that really never had his own adventure up until that point. Well, that is unless you want to count Mario as missing, but I don't think Luigi wants to remember that either. It was a departure from typical launch titles. It was slower, more deliberate, and it showed off the GameCube's graphical capabilities with impressive lighting and particle effects for the time. Other notable launch games included Wave Race Blue Storm, a jet ski racer that emphasized water physics and weather effects, and Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, Rogue Leader. It was a visually impressive game at the time that demonstrated the GameCube's ability to handle cinematic presentation. Super Smash Bros. Melee, while not a launch title, released shortly after and became the console's killer app and is still played to this day, even with multiple other Smash games coming out since. And fun fact, the Nintendo Switch 2 will likely mark the first time Melee will be re-released officially. I don't know why the Wii U or Switch didn't have GameCube Virtual Console, but I digress. Game Boy Advance 2001. GBA released in 2001 to follow up the massively popular Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and it would only end up being the main handheld for Nintendo for 3 years, but we would get quite a nice library for it. The GBA launched with 15 games, but you probably only know a couple. A remake of Super Mario Bros. 2, at least the US version. Super Mario Advance brought enhanced visuals, digitized voice samples, and improved controls to a handheld audience. Though some criticized Nintendo for launching with a remake rather than a brand new game. Inclusion of the original Mario Bros. Arcade game as a bonus was a nice touch, and we would also see this in Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. We would later get a few more games in the Super Mario Advance series, and I loved playing these as a kid. F-Zero Maximum Velocity was a true launch exclusive. This entry into Nintendo's now forgotten racing series used the GBA's impressive Mode 7 style scaling and rotation effects, similar to the SNES. It lacked familiar characters like Captain Falcon for some reason, but was a solid enough racing experience. It showed that handhelds could be used for this genre. We later got Mario Kart Super Circuit, which, while not as fast as the game, I know many of you are nostalgic for it. Castlevania Circle of the Moon. This third-party standout combined action platforming with light RPG elements in a Metroidvania-style game. Though it would later be somewhat overshadowed by future GBA Castlevania entries, Circle of the Moon was a strong and atmospheric start for the system, showcasing how third-party developers were ready to support the GBA in meaningful ways. Like I mentioned, there were 15 launch games you can see on screen now. Rayman was another one that you may know, but in my personal opinion, the series peaked with Rayman Legends. Nintendo DS 2004. The DS launched in 2004 and took the gaming world by storm. It featured 2 screens, with one being a touchscreen. And remember, this was 2004. Smartphones were practically non-existent, so touchscreens weren't very common and certainly not used for gaming. Nowadays, it's harder to find a portable screen that isn't a touchscreen, and the launch library for the DS was pretty weak. There were only 7, and you probably only know one of them. Easily the biggest launch title, and it isn't remotely close. Super Mario 64 DS was a remake and expansion of the N64 classic. It added new characters, new stars, and touchscreen-based minigames. The addition of Yoshi, Luigi, and Wario as playable characters added variety and finally answered the question that yes, L is real. The game made a strong case for the DS's 3D capabilities, and while the D-pad controls weren't ideal for 3D movement, it was a graphical improvement. Well, sort of. The resolution was lower, but the models looked more modern. Weird that Nintendo re-released this on a system without an analog stick or 3D movement control, but I loved this game as a kid and didn't care. And just a note, it technically did have 3D movement control, if you do count the touchscreen, but no one was playing that way. Feel the Magic XYXX. This Sega-developed title, known as Project Rub in some regions, leaned heavily into the DS's touchscreen and microphone capabilities. The game was a collection of quirky, suggestive mini-games wrapped in a bizarre love story. It exemplified how the DS could be used for weird, innovative gameplay. It wasn't for everyone, but it stood out in a good way. Asphalt Urban GT. Gameloft brought this racing game to the DS to offer a more traditional gameplay option. With a decent selection of licensed cars and track, it scratched the racing itch for players who weren't into platformers or puzzle games. Now moving on to the Nintendo Wii in 2006. When the Wii launched, it did so with a game that showed what the system could do. Wii Sports. Bundled with the system in most regions, Wii Sports was more than just a collection of motion-controlled minigames. It was a proof of concept that helped everyone from kids to grandparents understand the Wii's unique control scheme. The games were simple: tennis, bowling, boxing, golf, and baseball. but they were addictive, social, and accessible. It became the go-to party game and helped the Wii break into the demographics no console had reached before. This was another phenomenon that took the world by storm. If you're watching this video, you either played Wii Sports or are under 10 years old. I will still play this occasionally in 2025. It's just so simple but never gets old. Wii Sports can be talked about in a whole other video, but there were other launch games, which is why we're here. While Wii Sports got most of the attention, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was also a launch title, and it was a massive game. Originally developed for GameCube, it was ported to the Wii and enhanced with motion controls. It offered a darker tone and an expansive world that fans had been craving since Majora's Mask. Link's ability to transform into a wolf, Midna's mysterious storyline, and their turn to a more traditional fantasy aesthetic made it an instant classic. Twilight Princess actually wasn't a launch title for some regions, but I'm just talking about North America in this video. Excite Truck and Red Steel rounded out the launch lineup, but Wii Sports and Twilight Princess carried the system's early success. There were a bunch of other launch titles, most being gimmicky third-party shovelware, but let us know in the comments if you played any of these. Nintendo 3DS, 2011. Following the massively successful DS, the Nintendo 3DS had a pretty weak launch library like its predecessor. Big system seller Super Mario 3D Land wouldn't come out until a little bit later. Pilot Wings Resort was more there as a tech showcase like its predecessors, but it brought players back to Woohoo Island from Wii Sports Resort and let them explore in planes, rocket belts, and gliders. It demonstrated the 3D depth effect well, but was somewhat content-light, acting more as a proof of concept than a must-have game. Nintendo really seemed to love having Pilotwing games as launch titles. I remember getting this for like $5 at a GameStop, and it was a fun time waster for a bit. Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition. Capcom's Fighter was a surprisingly full-featured port of the console version, complete with all character stages and a functional online mode. The stereoscopic 3D effect and simplified control options made it a flashy, accessible launch title that catered to a more hardcore crowd that held over 3DS fighting fans until Smash 3DS in 2014. Nintendogs plus Cats. The sequel to the smash hit Nintendogs, this pet simulator added kittens and improved interactivity through the 3DS's camera and augmented reality capabilities. This had a lot of appeal as a casual game. Once again, Ubisoft also had a Rayman game at launch with Rayman 3D, and yeah, this game wasn't the best. Nintendo Wii U, 2012. The Wii U's launch lineup was one of the largest in Nintendo's history with 32 games, but quantity did not equate to quality. The flagship title, Nintendo Land, was meant to be the Wii U's Wii Sports, a showcase of what the new gamepad could do. It featured minigames based on Nintendo franchises like Zelda, Metroid, Animal Crossing, but it lacked the intuitive appeal of Wii Sports. It was fun, especially in multiplayer, but failed to capture the public's imagination. I personally love this game, and it made me want to get the Wii U after I played it at a friend's house, but I was already a Nintendo fan at this point. I highly doubt grandparents are picking us up to play Nintendo Land like Wii Sports. I'd love a new Nintendo Land for Switch 2 though. Let me know in the comments if you want that as well. New Super Mario Bros. U. It was a solid traditional 2D platformer with crisp visuals and tight level design, but it felt unoriginal, especially considering how it came out the same year as another new Super Mario Bros. Game and New Super Mario Bros. 2. It was also Zombie U, a third-party survival horror game that utilized the gamepad for inventory and scanning mechanic, and while divisive, it showed creative potential and tried to appeal to a mature audience. It just never sold that well on the Wii U and was later released for other consoles. Unfortunately, the Wii U's messaging was confusing and the gamepad's role was never as clearly defined as the Wii Remote. Despite some great games, the system stumbled out of the gate and never recovered. Nintendo Switch, 2017. If the Wii U was a stumble, the Switch was a full-on sprint out of the gate, and its launch title, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, was the reason why. The launch titles were few, but one of them made up for it. Breath of the Wild didn't just reinvent Zelda, it redefined open-world gaming. It gives players a massive, beautiful, physics-driven sandbox and said, go from the moment you step out of the Shrine of Resurrection. The sense of freedom is overwhelming, and you can climb anything. You solve puzzles however you want, and approach objectives in any order. You can go from the beginning to fight Ganon if you want. The game's systems interacted in surprising ways, like lightning striking metal weapons, fire spreading through grass, temperature affecting your health. Critics and fans alike were stunned. It won countless Game of the Year awards and sold millions of units, making it one of the most successful launch titles of all time. It did also launch on the same day as the Wii U, but I think most of us experienced it on the Switch. Other launch titles included games like 1-2 Switch, a quirky minigame collection that showcased the Joy-Con's capabilities, and Super Bomberman R, which brought classic multiplayer fun. Let's be honest, this was a Zelda show. I actually did like 1-2 Switch, but it just was not worth the $50 I paid. This should have been a pack-in title, just like with the Nintendo Switch Tech Demo, which for some reason is sold for $10, and I think that's arguably worse. Talking about that, Nintendo Switch 2, 2025. The Switch 2 recently launched with Mario Kart World as its flagship title, and we haven't gotten a brand new Mario Kart game since 8 all the way back in 2014, but with a higher price tag at a whopping $80 if you buy this without the bundle, Nintendo really needed to do some serious work to justify this cost. Personally, I think it's a great game, but $80 is really steep. There are other Switch 2 launch games like Split Fiction, Hogwarts Legacy, and Cyberpunk 2077, but these are all ports of games that came out in the past couple years on superior hardware. We are getting some more games this year, but for the price of the Switch 2, we better be getting some outstanding games coming out soon. Nintendo's launch titles have ranged from groundbreaking like Super Mario 64, Wii Sports, Breath of the Wild, to experimental like Luigi's Mansion and Nintendo Land. And while not every launch has been a home run, each one reflects Nintendo's boldness and unique approach to gaming. Whether it's through genre-defining platformers, innovative hardware gimmicks, or massive open world, Nintendo has repeatedly reshaped the gaming landscape starting on day one. But what are your favorite Nintendo launch day titles? Did you grow up playing any of these games on day one? Let me know your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment as it really helps me out. I'll see you next time.